wait. You have to be nice and easy. Nice and easy. She's very aggressive. Okay, please.
Thanks, Mr. President. Can you tell us how this free economic zone would work in the Donbass and in land that the Russians took by force?
Well, I don't want to do that now. It's a very complex situation, but it would work, and a lot of people want to see it work. And all I want to do is I want to stop the death of 25,000 people.
What you just watched is not an isolated incident in a vacuum. It is the crystallization of a deeply pathological pattern that reveals everything you need to understand about power, gender, and the collapse of democratic norms in this moment. Because President Donald Trump called White House reporter Yamache Alcindor very aggressive during a press conference inside the Oval Office on Friday, and this is the exact kind of language that patriarchy has weaponized for centuries to silence women who dare to ask questions that make powerful men uncomfortable, who dare to occupy space that has been jealously guarded by masculine authority since time immemorial. And what we're seeing here is nothing less than the President of the United States deploying the oldest trick in the misogynist playbook, which is tone policing, which is telling a woman that the problem is not what she's asking but how she's asking it, that she needs to be nice and easy, she needs to modulate her voice and soften her presence, and essentially perform the kind of deferential femininity that men like Trump believe is women's natural state. And here's what makes this moment so explosively significant. Here's why this 60-second clip should be setting off alarm bells in every newsroom and every civics classroom and every space where we claim to care about democracy, because Friday's exchange with Alcindor is part of an uptick of Trump's verbal attacks on female reporters, particularly women of color, covering the White House, and this is not some accidental slip of the tongue. This is a deliberate, systematic campaign of intimidation, designed to create a chilling effect on the free press, and it's working. Just this week, the president lashed out at ABC News correspondent Rachel Scott when she asked him about releasing video footage from a controversial boat strike in the Caribbean Sea, calling her the most obnoxious reporter in the whole place, and even more grotesquely, last month, President Trump told another female reporter, "Quiet piggy," when she attempted to ask him a question about releasing the FBI files on Epstein, which is language so degrading, so deliberately dehumanizing that it belongs in the annals of authoritarian history, alongside every dictator who ever tried to break the will of journalists by reducing them to animals. Now let's talk about what Trump was actually deflecting from when he decided to humiliate Yamache Alcindor in front of the entire White House press corps, because she was asking about something rather specific and rather important. She was asking about a free economic zone in parts of the eastern Donbass region from which Ukraine would withdraw under a negotiated peace with Russia, which is to say, she was asking about a plan that would essentially legitimize Russia's illegal invasion and territorial conquest by creating some kind of euphemistic buffer zone that sounds suspiciously like appeasement dressed up in the language of economic development. Zelensky said serious questions remain about who would manage the territory and how to ensure that troop withdrawals were fair and reciprocal, which is diplomat speak for this entire proposal is morally bankrupt and strategically insane. And Trump's response when confronted with the complexity of his own disastrous foreign policy was to attack the woman asking the question rather than answer it, which tells you everything about how this administration operates. The sheer scale of Trump's escalating war on women journalists is staggering when you actually compile the receipts, when you actually look at the pattern that has emerged just in recent weeks, because in the past 2 months alone, Trump has called a female reporter piggy while telling her to be quiet, dismissed CNN's Caitlin Collins as stupid, insulted a New York Times reporter's looks, called another female reporter stupid 3 times in quick succession, described another female reporter as obnoxious and a terrible reporter for asking him about his lethal boat strikes, and threatened to revoke ABC's broadcast license after fielding questions from their White House correspondent. This is not normal presidential behavior. This is not even normal authoritarian behavior. This is the behavior of a man who is so deeply threatened by women with institutional authority and the ability to ask him questions in public that he cannot control his own pathological need to dominate and diminish them. And here's where we need to understand the intersectionality of what's happening here, because critics argue the president reserves particular venom for female reporters, and female reporters of color even more so. And that's not an accident. That's not coincidental. That's the compounding effect of misogyny and racism operating in tandem to identify the women who Trump perceives as most transgressive against the natural order he imagines should exist, where white men like him get to hold forth without being challenged by black women, by women of color, by any woman who refuses to accept the subordinate role that centuries of patriarchal conditioning have tried to impose. Yamache Alcindor, who is a black woman, has been targeted by Trump before in 2018. He accused her of asking him a racist question after she asked him whether his embrace of nationalism had emboldened white nationalists, and he shushed Alcindor during an exchange in 2020, at the height of the George Floyd protests, when she asked him how he planned to address the issue of systemic racism. The language Trump uses is not random. It is carefully calibrated to invoke deeply misogynistic tropes that have been used to control women's behavior in public spaces for generations. And when he tells Yamiche Alcindor to be nice and easy, he is deploying what scholars of gender and power have identified as a classic double bind, where women in professional contexts are punished if they're too assertive, because then they're aggressive or bitchy or difficult, and they're equally punished if they're too deferential, because then they're weak or incompetent or not serious. There is no winning move in this game. There is no way for a woman journalist to ask tough questions of a president who fundamentally does not believe women should be asking him anything at all without his permission. And let's be absolutely clear about what aggressive means in this context, because Yamiche Alcindor was literally just trying to get the president's attention to ask a question, which is the job of a White House correspondent, which is what every journalist in that room is supposed to be doing, and yet when she does it, she gets publicly scolded like a child and labeled as aggressive, while male reporters who shout questions and interrupt and demand answers are simply doing their jobs. This is the textbook definition of a gendered double standard, and it's being performed by the President of the United States in real time, teaching millions of Americans that this is acceptable behavior, that this is how you treat women who step out of line, that public humiliation is an appropriate response to a woman who won't stay quiet. Now let's zoom out and understand this in the broader context of Trump's authoritarian approach to press freedom, because these attacks are a symptom of the administration's escalating authoritarianism, with similar attacks against women journalists seen elsewhere in the world in India, Philippines, Argentina, with the presumed aim of undermining their credibility and to deter scrutiny of the administration's actions. And what we're watching is Trump taking pages directly from the playbook of autocrats like Viktor Orban in Hungary, like Erdogan in Turkey, like Duterte in the Philippines, all of whom have used gendered attacks on women journalists as part of a broader strategy to delegitimize the press and consolidate authoritarian control. Since taking office in January, President Donald Trump has waged an aggressive campaign against the media, unlike any in modern U.S. history, making moves similar to those of authoritarian leaders that he has often praised. The administration's actions go far beyond verbal insults. They include systematic efforts to punish media outlets that provide critical coverage, because Brendan Carr, the newly installed Federal Communications Commission chair, has launched investigations into NPR and PBS, into a San Francisco radio station, and the FCC has also reopened a probe of CBS for news distortion, and reopened a probe of ABC, which is the government using its regulatory power to intimidate the press, which is exactly what authoritarian regimes do when they want to control the information environment. And Associated Press reporters were blocked from covering Trump at White House events for 2 days in a row, after the AP continued to refer to the body of water just south of the United States as the Gulf of Mexico instead of the Gulf of America, which is so petty and vindictive and Orwellian that it would be funny if it weren't terrifying. And here's what should terrify everyone who cares about democracy. Here's what should have us all in the streets demanding better, because Nicole Wallace described Trump's comments as verbal violence and a verbal assault on another female journalist. And she's right to use that language, because this is violence even if it's not physical. This is assault even if there are no bruises, because the purpose of this behavior is to intimidate, to silence, to make women journalists afraid of what will happen if they do their jobs too well, if they ask the questions that need to be asked, if they refuse to be deferential in the face of power. And the most damning thing, the thing that should shame every single person who was in that room, is that Kirby, not one of the male reporters standing beside Lucy or Bruce, spoke up, because access is a fragile currency in Washington, and solidarity is too often spent last, because when the President of the United States treats women journalists like this, when he calls them piggies and tells them to be quiet, and labels them as aggressive for doing their jobs, he is sending a signal to every autocrat and strongman and tin-pot dictator around the world that this is acceptable behavior, that this is how you handle a free press that won't fall in line. Trump's approach to governing has drawn comparisons to Orban, who has been in power since 2010, and the Hungarian leader has made hostility toward the press central to his political brand, borrowing Trump's phrase fake news to describe critical outlets, and now Trump is borrowing right back, creating a transatlantic feedback loop of authoritarian media strategy that threatens press freedom on both continents. We need to talk about the chilling effect this creates not just for current journalists, but for the next generation of women who might want to enter this profession, because aspiring young journalists might feel reporting is not for them because of how the president treats women in the industry, and reporters might refrain from asking tough questions to avoid direct attacks from the commander-in-chief, which is exactly the outcome Trump wants. He wants to make journalism so hostile, so degrading, so personally dangerous for women that they self-select out of the profession or self-censor their coverage, and if that happens, then he will have succeeded in his broader project of destroying the free press without ever having to actually shut down a newspaper or jail a reporter. He'll have done it through sustained psychological warfare. And let's connect this to the larger pattern of Trump's treatment of women throughout his entire public life, because this is the man who was caught on tape bragging about grabbing women by their genitals, who has been accused of sexual assault by dozens of women, who has spent his entire career reducing women to their appearance and their willingness to please him, who built a business empire partly on beauty pageants where he could literally inspect women's bodies and judge their worth. The gender politics is quite complex because sometimes misogyny is just a convenient way of attacking and discrediting a perceived opponent, because sexism is so entrenched in public life. But many of Trump's previous actions clearly demonstrate that he has a particular problem with seeing women as equals, including his comments on the Access Hollywood tape. The specific context of what Alcindor was trying to ask him about makes this even more grotesque, because Trump later called on Alcindor, permitting her to ask a question about the photos from Jeffrey Epstein's estate released by Democrats on the House Oversight Committee on Friday that featured Trump and other rich and powerful men, which means she was trying to ask him about his connections to a convicted sex trafficker and pedophile, and his response was to call her aggressive and tell her to be nice and easy, which is exactly the kind of deflection and tone policing you would expect from someone who doesn't want to answer questions about why he spent so much time with Jeffrey Epstein. The irony is almost too heavy to bear. A man with documented connections to a serial sexual abuser telling a female journalist that she needs to be nicer when she asks him about it. The Ukraine question is equally revealing because it shows how Trump uses these gendered attacks to avoid substantive policy discussions, because the U.S. proposed turning Donbass into a free economic zone, which would mean Ukrainian forces withdraw from Donbass and Russia refrains from entering the parts of Donbass it does not currently occupy, which is a plan so morally compromised, so obviously favorable to Russian aggression that any journalist worth their salt would have follow-up questions, would want to know how this isn't just rewarding Putin for invading a sovereign nation, and Trump's response when faced with those questions was to attack Yamake Alcindor's tone rather than defend the substance of his policy. His growing frustration appears to be aimed not at the Kremlin, but at Kiev and its backers in Europe, which tells you everything about whose side Trump is really on in this conflict. And when a black woman journalist asks him to explain the details of a plan that would abandon Ukraine to Russian imperial ambitions, he responds by policing her femininity, by demanding she perform a version of womanhood that is pliant and deferential and non-threatening. This is how patriarchy and authoritarianism reinforce each other, how the personal becomes geopolitical, how the way a president treats women in his own press room is directly connected to how he treats sovereign nations in international negotiations. And we have to understand that the White House's defense of this behavior is just as insidious as the behavior itself, because White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt defended these remarks and praised the president's frankness in calling a reporter piggy, which is gaslighting on an institutional scale, which is the administration trying to normalize abuse by rebranding it as authenticity, by pretending that degrading women is just Trump being Trump, just him telling it like it is. Appallingly, the White House press secretary suggested everyone should appreciate the frankness and the openness when asked about the president's behavior toward women journalists. This is part of a broader right-wing project to redefine cruelty as candor, to rebrand bigotry as anti-political correctness, to make Americans so exhausted by constant outrages that we just accept this as normal, that we throw up our hands and say, well, that's just Trump being Trump, and that normalization is the most dangerous thing of all. Because once we accept that the president can call women journalists piggies and tell them to be quiet, and label them as aggressive for asking questions, once we accept that as just part of the background noise of American politics, then we have already lost the battle for democratic norms, we have already surrendered to authoritarianism, even if we haven't admitted it to ourselves. The philosophical question at the heart of this is about who gets to speak and under what conditions, who gets to ask questions and who gets to decide whether those questions are legitimate. And what we're seeing is Trump attempting to reimpose a social order where women, especially women of color, do not have the authority to interrogate men in power without first seeking permission and demonstrating proper deference. This is the patriarchal bargain laid bare. This is thousands of years of male domination trying to reassert itself in the face of feminist progress, and Trump is the avatar of that backlash, the living embodiment of every man who ever felt threatened by a woman who wouldn't shut up and smile. Hannah Arendt wrote about how totalitarianism doesn't emerge overnight. It emerges through the gradual destruction of the public realm, through the erosion of spaces where citizens can gather and speak truth to power, and what Trump is doing to the White House press corps is a textbook example of that process. He's not just attacking individual journalists, he's attacking the very idea that journalists have a legitimate role in democracy. He's trying to transform the press briefing from a space of accountability into a space of performance where journalists are props who exist to make him look good, and any journalist who refuses that role, especially any woman journalist who refuses that role, gets publicly humiliated as punishment. And here's what makes this moment so urgent. Here's why we cannot look away or move on to the next outrage without processing what just happened. Because Wallace said we're either going to normalize this and usher in an era of unprecedented misogyny, or that press corps is going to act as one and say no more. And she's absolutely right that this is a fork-in-the-road moment. This is where we decide what kind of country we're going to be, whether we're going to defend the basic principle that women have the right to do their jobs without being degraded and insulted by the president, or whether we're going to accept that this is just how things are now. The historical parallels are chilling when you look at how authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century targeted women journalists as part of their broader campaigns against press freedom, how the Nazis went after women in the press, how Stalin purged women journalists who wouldn't toe the line, how every fascist movement has understood that controlling women's access to public speech is essential to maintaining patriarchal and authoritarian control. Trump may not be Hitler or Stalin, but he's reading from the same playbook. He's using the same techniques of public humiliation and gender-based degradation to send a message to all women journalists that they are not safe, they are not welcome, they need to watch their tone or face consequences. The legal scholar Catherine McKinnon has written extensively about how sexual harassment in the workplace is not just about individual bad behavior, it's about maintaining gender hierarchy. It's about ensuring that women who enter male-dominated spaces understand they are there on sufferance and can be expelled at any moment if they don't comply with male authority. What Trump is doing in the White House press room is a form of sexual harassment. It may not meet the legal definition, because he's not making explicitly sexual advances, but he is absolutely using gender as a weapon to discipline and control women who are trying to do their jobs, and that is harassment. That is creating a hostile work environment. That is telling women that their professional competence matters less than their willingness to perform femininity in ways that make powerful men comfortable. And we need to be clear that this isn't just about protecting journalists, this is about protecting democracy itself, because press freedom groups have long alleged that the president's disparaging rhetoric against journalists contributes to a broader decline in press freedoms in the U.S. by creating an environment of hostility and intimidation, and the Society of Professional Journalists said these incidents are not isolated, they are part of an unmistakable pattern of hostility, often directed at women, that undermines the essential role of a free and independent press. When journalists cannot ask questions without fear of public humiliation, when they have to calculate whether pressing the president for an answer is worth being called obnoxious or aggressive or piggy, then the entire system of democratic accountability breaks down. The fact that Trump is doing this while simultaneously proposing to abandon Ukraine to Russian aggression, while simultaneously dodging questions about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, while simultaneously pursuing policies that will harm millions of Americans, is not coincidental. The misogyny is not separate from the authoritarianism. The attacks on women journalists are not separate from the attacks on democratic institutions. They are all part of the same project. They are all part of Trump's attempt to create a political culture where he can do whatever he wants without scrutiny, where power is unaccountable, where women and other marginalized groups know their place and stay in it. What Yamiche Alcindor did in that moment, what all these women journalists are doing by continuing to show up and ask questions despite the abuse they face, is an act of extraordinary courage that should be recognized as such. They are literally putting their bodies and their reputations on the line to defend the principle that democracy requires an adversarial press, that power must be questioned, that women have just as much right as men to demand answers from their president. And when Trump tells Alcindor to be nice and easy, when he calls her aggressive, he is trying to break that courage. He is trying to make her and every other woman journalist think twice before asking the tough questions. But here's the thing that should give us hope. Here's why this fight is not lost, even though it feels overwhelming and exhausting, and like we're sliding into something dark and authoritarian. Because women journalists are not backing down. They are not shutting up. They are not being nice and easy. They are continuing to ask the questions that need to be asked. And that resistance matters. That refusal to be intimidated matters, because every time a woman journalist stands up to Trump's bullying and keeps doing her job, she is proving that his power is not absolute, that his ability to humiliate and degrade has limits, that women will not be forced back into silence no matter how much he rages. Mrs. will not be quiet. Not now. Not ever. And that's the spirit that has to animate our resistance to this authoritarian moment. That absolute refusal to accept that cruelty and misogyny and abuse of power are just normal features of American politics now. We have to keep calling this out, keep being outraged, keep demanding better, because the alternative is to accept that women's equality was just a brief aberration in human history, that democracy was just a nice experiment that didn't work out, that powerful men will always be able to treat women however they want without consequences. This is the fight of our generation. This is the fight that will determine what kind of country we hand to the next generation. And it's happening right now in real time in moments like this one where Trump calls Yamiche Alcindor aggressive and tells her to be nice and easy. We can accept it and normalize it and move on. Or we can recognize it for what it is, which is an attack on democracy, an attack on women's equality, an attack on the very idea that all citizens have the right to question power. The choice is ours, the moment is now, and history will judge us by what we do next.